Hey, content warning, there's like a lot of sexual assault and violence against women and violence against sex workers in particular in this episode. And also just like some genuinely bad attitudes towards sex workers and sex work itself. So like, that's gonna be in it. It's the Forever Knight-A-Thon Season 2. We're recapping and reviewing every single episode of Season 2 of the 1990s Canadian police procedural Forever Knight about a vampire detective taking a bite at a crime. Season 2, Episode 2, A Fate Worse Than Death, opens with a beautiful lady getting ready for a night of passion. Her would-be gentleman caller stumbles into the room excitedly, only to gasp, shock, find that she's been the victim of a murder most foul. An incidental female character getting murdered? Classic Forever Knight. Turns out that lady, Julie, was a sex worker, which you can tell because she wore red lipstick. She also had a matchbook from the Raven on her person, so Nick and Skanky head there. I mean, Nick would have went there anyway. It's the only way he knows how to investigate crimes, but you know, it's justified in the story in this episode at least. Janette explains that she tries to protect sex workers at the Raven because she's based.
I offer them a refuge. Some of them take it for an hour or a day.
This is a Janette-focused episode, and the flashbacks tell the story of how Lacroix brought Janette across. In her mortal life, Janette herself had been a survival sex worker. It's a genuinely good character study for her about how she felt powerless and abused in life, and vampirism serves as the means by which she can protect herself now. It helps contextualize how Janette, as someone who seems deep down to be kind and caring, can view being a vampire, a pretty brutal, violent thing, as a gift and a privilege, and why she so clearly resents Nick's desire to become mortal. It also goes some of the way towards explaining why she's so guarded and emotionally walled off. For that matter, why her relationship with Nick is important to her at all, because Nick, you see, was the first man in her life to just be like a decent dude to her and not treat her like an object. Lacroix claims to not think of her as an object, but he is Lacroix. He does think of everyone as his personal possession. In her mortal life, she was forced to watch on helplessly as one of her friends was sexually assaulted and murdered after becoming pregnant. While Nick looks back on his time as a murder monster with guilt, having gone from a normal person with a normal moral compass to a murder maniac, Janette went from being the subject of violence to the perpetrator. It was kill or be killed for her. And interestingly, this episode doesn't actually condemn her for that. It doesn't portray her revenge as misguided, but instead as liberatory. This memory of her friend's murder drives Janette to be uncharacteristically forthright in helping Nick and Skanky's investigation. They're looking for Julie's pimp, but Janette explains that while sex workers are welcome at the Raven,
The women are welcome, the men who think that they own them are not.
Nick dismisses her show of solidarity, and Janette gets to shut him the fuck down.
I didn't think you cared about their kind.
But they are my kind, Nicola. We are all ladies of the night.
This sets up the primary conflict of the episode. Nick, as a stand-in for the police force and other patriarchal institutions, doesn't understand or sympathize with Janette or the other sex workers. At least, not to the extent they require him to. On the surface, they might appear to want to help them and protect them, but they view the violence sex workers receive as ultimately the result of their own choices. There's a persistent theme of male police officers explaining that you can only help people who want to be helped, and that sex workers will always go back to the streets no matter how much a cop intervenes on their behalf, and like, woof. You could read that as a condemnation of the paternalistic attitude law enforcement and government in general has toward sex workers, and it is a little bit that, like, let's give them some credit, there's a little bit of that there. It's just like, I wish it were uncomplicatedly just that, but instead, let's just jump ahead a minute here. Turns out the killer in this one, it's not that pimp, it's not a John, it's this other sex worker, Celeste. Nick is trying to help her step out of the life, but she's too addicted to living the glitzy, glamorous lifestyle of a street-walking sex worker. In fact, she ends up killing the pimp, and she killed Julie to steal their business, and actively manipulates Janette into protecting her by playing the victim. So you see, any sympathy that people feel towards Celeste is weaponized and used to avoid any accountability for her malicious actions. Nick and the police aren't wrong for judging her motivations. Janette is wrong for wanting to help Celeste on her own terms. This episode implies that sex work is something that women do, and it is only women in this episode, because they're greedy or they want easy money. And it is a seductive lifestyle which draws people in and predates upon them, paralleled by Lacroix drawing in Janette and predating upon her. Sex work, as presented in this episode, is always a deliberate choice that could have been avoided and always the wrong choice. Sex work is a problem to be solved, and it is exclusively solved by helping women no longer be sex workers, which is supremely weird and bad for a few reasons. Firstly, Mortal Janette is very clearly portrayed as a survival sex worker. She does sex work because it's her only option. The dangers and pitfalls of sex work are therefore irrelevant. It's either do that or starve. So it's very strange that the episode presents modern-day sex work as exclusively something that women choose to do despite the dangers involved, rather than something they might be forced into due to financial necessity. Secondly, while we're invited to be sympathetic with the sex worker characters, we're also expected to condemn their decadence and refusal to accept help. They're victims, but also choose to remain victims. And I hope I don't have to tell you how paternalistic that is, that the cops know better than these women how to keep themselves safe, and that their problems are the result of them refusing to accept the help that is freely offered. They always have the option to choose something else, but lack the moral clarity to choose a better life. It seems to exist within a world where social services to help sex workers are all freely available. It's not something we need to invest in or change at all. The big problem is just that the sex workers themselves don't want to use the resources available to them, not because those resources are insufficient or don't exist in the first place, but because it's so cool to get to be a sex worker. Thirdly, this episode presents sex work as a fundamentally immoral thing to both perform or purchase. It isn't simply dangerous. It is inevitably dangerous and cannot be anything but dangerous. It presents the act of sex work as more or less courting death, a ticking time bomb. No thought is spared for how a sex worker might make themselves safer other than simply foregoing sex work entirely. Now, come on, guys. I'm not expecting a police procedural from the 90s to campaign for the legalization and regulation of sex work, but it's so fucking weird to watch this episode 30 years after the fact and see how absolutist it is in this regard. It's just taken for granted that sex work is intrinsically self-destructive, something which fundamentally damages those who participate in it. And I worried when writing this, that simply describing how the show presents these things might lead you to believe that I shared that view. On the surface, it feels like they're trying to empathize with sex workers. It feels at times like they're trying to show the ways that the system lets them down, even. Janette's whole arc in this episode is about her intervening when she feels like the law has failed. She feels a responsibility to protect sex workers like Celeste and recognizes that the law will not do right by them. She fights against police complacency and the ways that sex workers are treated as disposable. She says, in no uncertain terms, that she views these people as her people.
But they are my kind, Nicola. We are all ladies of the night.
She decides to bring Celeste across to give her the power to defend herself just like Lacroix had done for her centuries earlier. But Nick stops her, and Janette learns the truth about Celeste. Janette realizes she almost made a huge mistake and reflects on what brought her to this point, but okay, seems like Janette should not be the one learning a lesson here. It seems like it should be Nick and the police force being forced to grapple with the double standards that they have. The story is positioned to be about redemption and how one has to choose to be better. And sure, that's true, but what did Janette do wrong that she has to choose better about? How must she choose to do better? How must she be redeemed? Her cardinal sin in this episode was trying to protect someone she cared about, someone who she had every reason to believe was being abused like she had been. Is the lesson not to believe people so easily when they talk about being abused? Because if it is, that sucks. Is it to merely accept that you are powerless in the face of institutional neglect and leave it to those institutions to solve problems even when it seems like they won't? Seriously, what lesson is Janette meant to be learning here? For the life of me, I can't think of one that doesn't suck ass. And sure, yeah, it's bad to make people into vampires. I get that. As we say around here, don't take chances with vampses. But considering what this episode establishes being a vampire means to Janette, it feels like a really sour note that we're expected to condemn what is, in essence, self-actualization, that we shouldn't grant sex workers or abused women in general the means by which to defend themselves unless they accept our conditions for good behavior first. This is a show about cops, but this is the first episode that feels like it is a cop. I feel like this episode is itself a cop. All of that being said, on a more positive note, I do love how this episode characterizes Janette. Janette is a very nuanced character, and I think this episode does a good job of fleshing her out a little bit. And there's a nugget of a good episode buried in here about how Janette is coming to terms with Nick wanting to change and how her desire to keep him as he is kind of hypocritical. Because to her, vampirism represents freedom. And if freedom is so important to her, she has to accept that Nick should also have the freedom to reject it. Likewise, Nick expecting Janette to change would be similarly hypocritical. Were she to do as he does, she'd be giving up her self-actualization in pursuit of his. It would be more interesting to watch Nick learn that. What if Janette were forced to reconcile her perception of the gift of immortality with the contradiction of that immortality coming at the expense of other people's lives? Whether it's worth becoming a predator in order to protect oneself from predation, because in her case, kinda might be. And that's interesting. And that's morally complicated. Nick fights crime to atone for his sins, to make up for the bad things he's done in order to hopefully allow himself to earn the right to be mortal again. Janette protects sex workers not out of some selfish urge to be redeemed. She doesn't feel like she needs to be redeemed, just out of genuine care and solidarity. Her vampirism doesn't just allow her to take revenge on her abusers, but allows her to create a safe space for her community in the present day. Her decision to accept being a vampire is just as valid as Nick's quest to become human, and I would have liked for this episode to lean into that a little more, to complicate the simple one-to-one morality of vampires we've been presented with thus far. That vampirism is evil, and the more vampire you are, the eviler you get. We know that's not the case. Vampires can be good sometimes. Janette's a vampire and she's cool as hell. It should be a story about how Nick views Janette being so cavalier about being a vampire as self-destructive, paralleling his paternalistic attitudes towards sex workers. And as Nick gets to know the sex workers and to understand them better, he should also come to realize that Janette doesn't represent the past he's running from. By explicitly rejecting mortality, she represents the future he is striving to achieve. She has accepted herself, and that ultimately, that's his goal too. Both characters would walk away with a clearer picture of one another and a greater respect for one another. Instead, we got some swerf bullshit. Fuck this. I just wanted to talk about the funny vampire show. Tomorrow, Nick meets an author who's not Anne Rice. She's not. Her name is Emily Weiss, and any relation to actual persons living or dead is a coincidence. I want to give a special thank you to my web puppets over on Patreon. We've got Wolfman Jack, Cooper Holmes, Joe McClory, Liz Widow, C.H. Phillips, Gideon, David Kaler, and Andrew Roger. And I, Bobby Duke, the star of the channel, would like to thank these other people who's also the stars of the channel. We got Jay Torney, Connor Patrick Griffin, Rachel Ratt, Cato Moore, Carpad, Josh Manes, and Hyla Tracy. Hope you're enjoying this forever night shit that Mildo insists on doing every year. I don't really get it myself. I don't know. I'm trying to reduce my screen time. That's just me, though, you know? Like, who cares about some show from the 90s nobody's ever heard of?